Hi, everyone. This is Kristen with the Ally Center at LBC. Welcome back to the Ally Advantage, where support meets strategy and students thrive. So, in our podcast, we focus on building confidence, clarity, and skills that you can use as an online student. So, joining us today from our online team are myself,
Hannah, Mariah.
Dr. McClenton.
So we're excited to cover today the writing process. Now, some of you might be thinking that's a really boring topic, but it's really not. It's just that it is a process and it isn't necessarily quick, but it is orderly and it has a basic framework that's consistent each time you sit down to write, no matter what it is that you're writing. There's kind of the skeletal process that you go through of steps. And so ideally, the writing process, it's very non-linear, it's organic, and it's very individual and very person specific. And so we're going to talk about that today, and how each of us approaches the writing process. We'll give kind of our hot takes on the writing process, things that have worked and haven't worked, and just kind of overall go through each of the steps quickly. So we will go ahead and start. I'll start with the steps in the writing process. So they are pre-writing. Then we've got thesis development, organizing and outlining, drafting, and then revising. Those are the steps in the process as a whole. As far as pre-writing goes, this might look different. You may have heard it called brainstorming, or maybe a professor has said mind mapping, where you just kind of throw ideas onto your paper in order to get your thoughts flowing. There's some preliminary research that's involved in the pre-writing process. And then my personal favorite pre-writing technique is free writing, where you're just, I call it word vomit, right? You just let the ideas flow, and you don't worry about spelling, grammar, and punctuation at this point in the process. So I'm going to pass it on to Dr. McClenton, and she's going to share with us some information about thesis development.
Our good old friend, the thesis. I like talking about the thesis because the thesis is the thing, the linchpin upon which everything else rests on, right?
Yep.
And the students would tell you that I talk about this ad nauseum, but I always talk about the thesis statement from the vantage point of the fact that you are a lawyer. And if you were a lawyer, you would make a decision that either you were going to prove someone's innocence or you'd prove someone's guilt, right?
I like
You
that.
would make a
Yeah.
singular statement. And so when you start thinking about the thesis statement, think about being that lawyer in the courtroom. You're going to say, ladies and gentlemen of the court, my client is innocent or they're guilty. That's the initial statement. It is not, they might be guilty, they might be innocent. It's one or the other. They're innocent or guilty. But then beyond that, you're going to have three claims that you make to support either their innocence or their guilt. And that is the thing that really sets up the framework for what you're going to write about. You're not asking a question. So the thesis statement is not a question. It is a specific claim that lets the reader know this is what I intend to prove. And if you keep the analogy of the lawyer, innocent or guilty based on 1, 2, 3, I think that will help frame the rest of your paper.
I like that. I like that a lot. All right. Mariah, would you like to share with us about organizing and outlining?
I would love to. To build on what Dr. McClenton said, I think it's important for you to let your thesis statement be the director of the rest of your paper. So whatever you're laying out in your thesis statement, you're telling your readers what to expect to come. And so if you say, well, I'm going to prove this person's innocence because of reason A, reason B, and reason C, then that actually sets up a really nice framing of your ideas of my first section of my paper is going to be about reason A. And then I will move to my next section, which will be reason B. And then I will not take a detour and talk about something unrelated. No. I will stick to the order that I have laid out in my thesis statement and address reason C. Whenever we're outlining and organizing, I think it can be difficult sometimes if we have a whole bunch of notes and you're like, everything's all
Mhm.
over the place. And so if you just start off with a basic outline, you say, okay, I know that I have to include these elements. Perhaps the assignment has laid out you have to hit a certain number of topics, or that you
Mhm.
have to operate. You have to connect with class notes, and then you have to connect with other contemporary writings, whatever the case may be. Lay out those basic things first, and then as you research, you start to organize those things together, whether it's in the form of a traditional outline, or if it's you write things down on index cards and move things around, or you do
Mhm.
something that's a little bit more mind map in nature, where you have, you draw the circle and you write your main idea, and then you draw the line out and you say, this is main idea one. And then you have, again, your spider web of ideas from there. Those are some different ways that you can organize your information to start saying, okay, I've done all this research. How does this fit into the ideas that I'm presenting from my thesis statement?
Fun fact, when I was in college, it was before computers were a big thing, and I used to cut my essays into paragraphs and do that very physically,
Yes.
rearranging so I could get my ideas in order. All right, Hannah, you're going to talk to us about drafting.
Yeah, it sounds like what you just shared, Kristen, is like a really nice explanation of like the post outlining method,
Mm,
actually, which is a really nice
perfect.
writing strategy to double check that all your paragraphs are in the correct order in relation to the thesis statement. And so you can cut up your paper, you can use sticky notes, but that's just kind of a free tip in the middle here. But I am talking about drafting, and drafting is where we take our outline and then we develop it into complete paragraphs with complete sentences. And so if you get to this stage in the writing process and feel entirely overwhelmed, there's a good chance that you didn't do the previous steps sufficiently or
Mm,
thoroughly enough. And
mhm.
so if you start to try to draft the paper and you don't really have anything to say, I would really strongly recommend that, as we talked about, the writing process is nonlinear. Go back, make sure that your thesis statement has a clear topic, claim, and three pieces of supporting evidence at least to then unpack in your actual paper. But ideally, if you do have enough information in your outline and you have a strong, solid sense of direction with your paper, then when you get to the drafting stage, it's really a matter of putting meat on the bones, so to
Mm,
speak, of your essay. And so here's where we're making sure that we're including topic sentences in each one of our body paragraphs, clearly noting the main idea for each body paragraph, and then incorporating our evidence and the explanation for that evidence, and adding transition statements so that our ideas are actually connected and it's not just our draft shouldn't feel like a bullet point list. It's okay if our
mm,
outline does a little bit, but we don't want our draft to feel just very staccato and just
mm,
a list of one thing after another. So we want to make
mm.
sure that we have a clear sense of how all of our ideas connect and merge and relate to one another and then support the thesis itself. So don't be afraid if the rough draft truly is rough. That is why
Yes.
rough is in the name. Just really focus on getting your content on the page, and the next steps in the process of revision and editing will help you then polish the product. But I'll let Kristen talk about that.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing I think is important, I'm going to talk about revising and editing, but the steps of the writing process, they really do build on each other. And so you can't really say that one step requires more effort or more work than the next because you will reap the rewards of whatever effort you put into the previous step in the writing process. So that's something it took me a long time to realize. But moving on, I'm going to talk about revising and editing. It is the final step in the writing process. It is an important step. I always encourage my students don't leave their revising and editing for your instructor. We want to make sure that we have given our draft several go throughs, several pass throughs from several people. And so the very first step in the revision and the editing process is always, always, I say, to read your draft out loud to yourself. Yes, you're talking to yourself in front of your computer, but your ears are going to catch things that your eyes don't. And I'm kind of getting into some tips here before we're there, but it's just such an important process, this revising that you're going to do before you submit anything as a final draft. And then as far as revising goes, revising is more to me editing content, editing flow, editing kind of the structure of a piece of writing, whereas editing is what it sounds like, the technical pieces, the spelling, the grammar, the punctuation, verb tenses, etc., etc. So they're similar, but they are different. And that's kind of a snapshot of the writing process and the steps in it as a whole. And so what I thought would be fun, if you can call it fun, I'm going to say fun, is to go through and share our personal writing process. And so I'm going to hand it right back to Hannah. She's going to be first on my list this time. If you could share your own personal writing process with us.
Absolutely. Yes. So in my undergraduate studies, I was an English major. And so I already came into college loving writing, reading, literature, all of the things. However, my process was extremely chaotic. And so I had a lot to say. I'd love to do the research, but I really did not have a streamlined sense of like, okay, how do I actually get all of the thoughts in my mind on the page, especially when I'm dealing with even more complex and nuanced topics and there's so many things that I want to say, but I want to make sure that they actually come across clearly to my professor. And so undergrad was like a slow process of actually realizing that I did need to outline on some level. I really just enjoyed like jumping into the drafting because I felt like I discovered so much of what I wanted to say through writing, and I still do, but I have had to force myself to have a structure for my argument based on my thesis. And so even if I start out with like, okay, these categories that I know are going to turn into multiple body paragraphs that are based on my thesis, and I'll probably end up moving around some of those body paragraphs. At least as long as I have a general plan of where I'm going, that just gives me a general structure. So that was kind of my undergraduate experience. And then I would say my graduate experience as well was an extension of that, but just on like a larger and wider scale of doing just continuing to refine that. But I just really enjoy taking notes on my research sources. And so just like taking a lot of notes, highlighting, gathering that into a document. But a lot of times that document will become massive. And so there's like so many quotes and so many paraphrases and summaries and things that I want to include into my paper. And so actually taking the time to figure out, okay, this is a great quote, but does it really support what my thesis is arguing? And we have to be honest with ourselves of, okay, that's a great quote. Maybe I'll put it on a sticky note on my wall, but it's not going in this paper. And so I would say that's how my writing process has developed over the years.
I like that. It's almost like a too much of a good thing type situation.
Exactly.
All right, Mariah.
So whenever I started off my undergraduate experience, I started in actually high school because I was taking college classes in high school. Whenever I took my first undergraduate class, it was through a community college. And up until that point, I hated writing until I took this class. And then all of a sudden, there was a flip that switched, and I was like, I love writing. And in that class was really the first time that I even thought about editing my work with any level of intentionality or rigor. And I can still remember whenever the professor had us raise our hands and say, okay, keep your hand up if you've gone through your paper this many times, this many times, this many times. And I was just so invested that I ended up being like the last man standing with my hand up. And that was perhaps a little bit of overkill. And I think that that process at that moment was sort of emblazoned into my soul a little bit, because then I got really excited about editing, maybe a little bit too excited about editing. And whenever I got to college, I would sometimes I would have a lot of time to get papers done, and sometimes I wouldn't. But I felt like I needed everything to be perfect along the way. And I feel like this might be perhaps a little bit of a theme in for those of us who are writers. But it took me forever to write everything because I was always editing as I was writing. And I felt like I couldn't move forward until I had completely made a transition perfect, or whatever the case may be. And so then I would get to the end and I would then look back and realize that my flow was all messed up. And I was like, oh, I just spent 2 hours on that transition and I have to rework it. And so that was definitely discouraging in a way, but at the same time affirming because I always got good grades on my papers, whether I spent a lot of time on them or not,
Or
which
not.
was also a problem because then I was like, oh wait, maybe I could be very last minute on this and still get
Let
a
me just
good
throw
grade.
this together real quickly.
And so by the time I got to grad school, my process was kind of all over the place because I hadn't found like my stride.
Mhm.
Whenever I was in grad school, the topics became a lot more complex and I struggled kind of a lot, especially with the organizational steps, figuring out how ideas related together. And I
Mhm.
remember a couple of papers, I had everything printed out. I had cut apart everything and I was moving things
Mhm.
around and like really trying to intentionally think through how do these ideas fit together? Like I
Yeah.
don't know how they're supposed to how they're
Yeah.
supposed to connect. Um, but I would say that I didn't really hit my stride in the writing process until I graduated grad school and got into just writing for my own stuff. So I will
Yeah.
actually, I'll pause and I'll come back and talk about this a little bit more later. But I feel like my writing process continues to evolve.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's all I got to say right now.
Dr. McClenton, I'm interested to hear. So, from your doctoral program, I'm interested to hear how your writing process kind of evolved or changed from undergrad to grad to then doctoral studies.
Okay. So I think I shared before how I had an affinity for writing. I recognized that early on, that I was a chatty kid and I was a creative kid, so, you know, a part of just writing in general had to do with connection, and
Yeah.
I think I shared with you how I just absolutely love my high school English teacher. And we just went on these journeys and, be writing things. And so just the ability to initially get things out was something that became second nature. And I saw that in undergrad. It's funny because I took a lot of lit courses, and the places that I was more skilled or came off better is when I was able to have a level of creativity. Like I can
Mm.
remember like British authors and, you know, just different periods that you were going through and having to write critical papers, and kind of like you did what you needed to do because those
Yeah.
were the rules of the game. Uh,
Right.
and so it's again, you did what I can just remember outside of creative writing in college, just doing what I needed to do to meet the requirements of the assignment. When I
Right.
got to graduate school, it was more again, you were not looking for places of creativity in as much as you were just bumping up your skill to make sure you were doing a graduate level paper. So it
Yeah.
was kind of like I was very much driven by rules and what the expectations were. And, like you give me a frame, you tell me what I need to do. And again, I had the um writing skills that were needed to build on whatever was foundational to what the professor was asking for. I think what really threw me, and have expressed this before, what threw me for a loop in the doctoral process is I was in a situation where you kept hearing about doctoral writing, but I didn't know what doctoral writing was. And I didn't know if that was like multisyllabic words, so let's find the big words. Let's get out the thesaurus. I didn't know in terms of like, did I need to think in my mind more sophisticated in a more sophisticated manner? I really didn't know. And I remember some fear and trepidation
Yeah.
about even putting my thoughts on paper, and I had a friend that basically said, um, how are things coming? Like, how are you doing in your process? She was towards the tail end of her dissertation. I was at like the beginning, and I'd say I'm taking notes. I'm taking notes. So I enjoyed like going and looking at journal articles and taking
Mm.
notes from the journals, paraphrasing what they were saying. That was my thing, and I felt very accomplished if I was able to take notes on this. And I took lots of notes, copious notes. And at one point she said, um, "What have you written?" Okay. And mind you, this is one of these programs where you met several times during the year, but it was up to you. There was no professor every day saying this is due here. No, you were
Right.
really into that online space, okay, before it became a
Yes.
thing, and really having to be a really evolved student, you know. And so I just remember, you know, going into the process where, all right, you have to shift from note taking to actually writing things. And
Right.
I think the thing that was liberating to me is that as I took the different classes, you generally had freedom to write. You were given kind of a broad topic, but you could weave your theme into it. And so before I even start writing my dissertation, I knew what I was going to write about. And I tried to then write about things that would tie into my bigger research process.
Mhm.
And I think after like just kind of leaping into it and doing well on my first paper, and oh, this is really good. I mean, it's one thing for your professor to say this is really good, but when they say, would you mind if I kept your paper? And can I, you know, it's like, oh, well, why? They want to keep my paper, you know? And so again, it's like you go from just writing to give them exactly what they want to having the freedom where you have to be more creative, but still hope that you're giving them what they want. And I think I just began being able to good grades on paper on the paper just kind of freed me up to just again, here's your idea. Now, how are you going to defend your idea? And I think the thing that, you know, when people, oftentimes you'll hear about people, they're ABD and they're all but doctorate. And it's because they took all those courses, but they
Yeah.
never figured out what they loved enough to research. And from day
Hmm.
one, I was really figuring out what is it that you're trying to prove? What is
Right.
something, what's the problem that you're trying to fix? And knowing what I wanted to prove, it's the thing that set in motion that journey I went on for several years and kept feeding stuff in it. If it wasn't attached
Hmm.
to where I was going, I threw it out. You know, so that
Yeah.
again, you saw something evolve and mature so that at the end of my draft, I had a document that was 811 pages. Now,
Right.
400, 400 were transcribed data that, you know, I paid someone to do, but 400 pages were me were
Yeah.
me writing like, you
Yes.
know, click, click, click. But again, I think back to what you guys have said, you find a way of organizing yourself. You get the outline, okay, you've got a thesis statement, and then you set out to prove through hundreds of
Mhm.
pages exactly what your thesis statement said.
Yes. Yes. I love that. I love that a lot. I know like from my undergrad to my grad days, I don't even think I really had a name for what the writing process was from my high school experience. Now, I've always had an affinity for writing. If you would have asked me when I was 8 what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would have said I wanted to be a writer. So I think in a lot of ways, because I was also such a voracious reader, that it was just kind of ingrained in me. And then I know, like when I got to my undergrad, I remember thinking right before I graduated high school, I can't wait to be in college. They are so smart in college. And then I got to college and it was like, you want me to follow what? What's this process you speak of? And so that's when I started connecting names to these stages in this system that got me from point A to point, Z down here, which would have been my essay that I was submitting. And I remember as an undergrad still thinking when I get to grad school, I'm going to be so smart because I thought that there was some like evolved process that was like higher and better, like the more school you went through. And then I got to my grad days and I'm like, I'll be darned, they are still using this same like 5 steps I've been using since like 8th grade. And so that to me, this is kind of I don't know, that shaped my writing process and kind of just helped knowing a name, being able to put a name to each of the steps, um, helped me refine it. And then, as I went into my career in education, it just helped me then explain that process to students. And that was kind of always my thing. I don't want my students to leave me and say, wait, there's a process for writing. Like I wanted them to always know that, this is what this step is, this is what it's called, this is what it looks like. Now, go out into the world, little bird, and write things. Well, thank you, team. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for part 1 of our discussion on the writing process here today on the Ally Advantage.